when a black man shows up for the job and finds her alone with red wine. Everything changes in tonight. Achilles Smith was about to discover that some system crashes lead to the most electrifying connections of all. The elevator doors slid open with a whisper, revealing the darkened expanse of Sterling Dynamics' executive floor at nearly midnight. Achilles adjusted his laptop bag and toolkit, the familiar weight of emergency calls settling into his shoulders like an old coat. The security guard had warned him the CEO was still in the building, working late on some presentation that had gone catastrophically wrong when their entire network decided to implode. 3 hours before the biggest merger meeting in company history. What the guard hadn't mentioned was that Victoria Sterling would be sprawled across her leather executive chair like Renaissance painting come to life, blonde hair spilling from its professional chignon in golden waves that caught the city lights streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Her silk blouse had surrendered 2 buttons to the evening's frustrations, and a nearly empty bottle of Bordeaux sat sentinel beside her dual monitors like a confession of defeat. "Thank God," she breathed when she spotted him, rising with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to navigate wine and high heels through years of corporate warfare. "Are you the miracle worker they sent to save my career?" Achilles found himself momentarily speechless, caught between professional courtesy and the way her voice carried. Just enough desperation to make him want to solve every problem she'd ever faced. "Achilles Smith, ma'am. I understand you're having server issues." Victoria laughed, a sound somewhere between exhaustion and hysteria. "Server issues? That's like calling the Titanic a minor navigation problem." She gestured toward the bank of monitors displaying error messages like digital screams of anguish. "Everything's corrupted. 5 years of merger data, presentation files, backup systems, all of it, just ... gone." He set down his equipment with practiced efficiency, already cataloging potential solutions while trying not to notice how the wine had painted her lips a deeper shade of pink, or how her perfume carried hints of jasmine and rebellion. "Let me take a look under here," he said, dropping to his knees beside her desk to access the primary server connections. The space beneath her executive desk felt intimate as a confessional, all shadows and the whisper of expensive fabric. When Victoria leaned over to watch him work, her hair created a curtain that smelled like luxury and longing. And her hand found his shoulder with the kind of touch that could have been accidental, if not for the way her fingers lingered against his shirt. "Can you really fix this?" she whispered, close enough that he could feel the warmth of wine on her breath. Achilles looked up into eyes the color of storm clouds and realized he was about to find out if some repairs were worth risking everything. 2 hours later, the executive floor server room hummed with the electric tension of resurrection and something far more dangerous. Achilles had managed to recover 60% of the corrupted files, his fingers dancing across keyboards with the kind of precision that made Victoria wonder what else those hands could accomplish with such focused intensity. "The backup systems weren't completely fried," he explained, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who spoke fluent technology. "Most of your presentation data is salvageable, but I need to rebuild the file architecture from scratch." Victoria stood closer than strictly necessary, ostensibly watching his screen, but really studying the concentrated furrow of his brow. The way his jaw tightened when he encountered particularly stubborn code. The wine had settled into her bloodstream like liquid courage, making everything feel heightened and inevitable. "You're saving my life," she murmured, then caught herself adding, "professionally speaking." The server room felt like a technological cave, all blinking lights and the white noise of cooling systems that created an oddly intimate cocoon. When Achilles needed to access the backup drives mounted near the ceiling, Victoria insisted on helping, stretching to hand him cables with movements that brought their bodies into alignment, like puzzle pieces, discovering their perfect fit. "Careful," he said, as she wobbled slightly on her heels, his hands automatically finding her waist to steady her. The contact lasted 3 seconds longer than safety required, his thumbs pressing against silk that might as well have been nothing at all. My husband hasn't touched me like that in 2 years, Victoria said quietly, the confession escaping before she could stop it. The wine had loosened more than her hair. It had unlocked truths she'd been storing in professional compartments marked "Do Not Open." Achilles went very still, his hands still spanning her waist, her back pressed against his chest in the narrow space between server racks. "Mrs. Sterling, Victoria," she corrected, turning in his arms until they were face to face in the flickering blue light of network diagnostics. "And Marcus is in Singapore until Thursday, closing a deal that's apparently more exciting than his wife." The air between them crackled with a kind of electricity that had nothing to do with fiber optic cables and everything to do with the way she was looking at him, like he might be the solution to more than just her technical problems. "The files," Achilles said weakly, but his voice had gone rough around the edges. "Will still be corrupted in 5 minutes," Victoria whispered, her fingers finding the buttons of his shirt with the same deliberate precision he'd used on her keyboard. "This is dangerous territory," he warned, even as his hands tightened on her waist. "I've been living in safe territory for 15 years. She breathed against his throat. "Maybe it's time for a system upgrade." The moment in the server room had ended with professional distance hastily restored, but the electricity between them had only intensified as they moved to Victoria's private suite. Her personal laptop, she claimed, contained the final presentation. Files that needed recovery, though the way she'd said it suggested recovery wasn't the only thing on her mind. "The files should be in here somewhere," Victoria said, settling beside Achilles on the leather sofa with wine-loosened grace. She'd abandoned her heels somewhere between the server room and here, and another button had mysteriously come undone on her silk blouse, revealing the kind of lace that made his fingers forget their purpose. Achilles focused on the laptop screen with the intensity of a man trying not to notice how her perfume had shifted from professional to purely feminine, how the wine had painted a flush across her collarbones that disappeared beneath expensive fabric. "Your photo directory seems to have some corrupted thumbnails," he said, clicking through folders with practiced efficiency. "Oh, those," Victoria murmured, moving closer under the pretense of seeing the screen better. Her thigh pressed against his as a folder opened, revealing images that definitely weren't merger presentations. Professional photos. Artistic and intimate Victoria in various states of undress that spoke of a woman discovering her own sensuality. The kind of photos that suggested she'd been preparing for a different kind of liberation long before tonight. "Wrong folder," she said, without embarrassment, her hand covering his on the trackpad. "Though I suppose you've seen what you've seen." Achilles felt his professional composure cracking like ice under pressure. "Mrs. Sterling, I should focus on the business files." "Should," Victoria repeated, turning to face him fully. The movement caused her blouse to gape open, revealing skin that looked impossibly soft in the dim office lighting. "I've spent 15 years doing what I should do, Achilles. Where has it gotten me? Alone at midnight, drunk on wine, begging a stranger to fix my broken systems." Her hand moved from the laptop to his chest, fingers tracing the edges of his shirt with deliberate intent. "Maybe it's time I did something I wanted to do instead." The space between them disappeared as she leaned closer, her lips parting in invitation. Achilles found himself suspended between desire and consequence, her mouth inches from his when the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. "Security rounds," Victoria breathed against his lips, but neither of them moved away. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of keys and radio static. Reality crashed back like cold water, reminding them both that some risks carried prices neither was prepared to pay. Yet Achilles sat in his Honda Civic in the parking garage's fluorescent purgatory, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel like it might anchor him to sanity. The taste of almost kissing her, almost crossing a line that would change everything, lingered on his lips. Like smoke from a fire, he'd barely escaped. 3 years building his consulting business from nothing. 3 years of proving that a black man from Roxbury could compete in Boston's elite tech circles without compromising his integrity or his pride. One moment of weakness with a lonely white CEO could incinerate all of it faster than corrupted hard drives. He'd seen what happened to men like him who forgot their place. The whispered accusations, the suddenly canceled contracts, the way opportunity dried up like water in drought. Marcus Sterling had the kind of connections that could blacklist him from every corporate client in the city with a few well-placed phone calls about inappropriate behavior and professional boundaries. But Christ, the way Victoria had looked at him not like a service provider or a vendor to be managed, but like a man she actually saw, wanted. Her fingers on his chest had felt like electricity, like every nerve ending in his body had suddenly remembered what desire meant. His phone buzzed against the dashboard. Victoria's name lighting up the screen like temptation with caller ID. He should let it go to voicemail. Should drive home to his empty apartment and pretend tonight had been just another emergency call. It's just another rich client with tech problems and too much wine. Instead, he answered on the 4th ring. Achilles. Her voice carried through the speakers like silken sign. I'm sorry to call so late, but I have an urgent situation at home. Your laptop? He asked, though they both knew this wasn't about laptops. My home network is completely down, Victoria said, and he could hear the wind-edged confession in her voice. Marcus won't be back until Thursday, and I have video conferences starting early tomorrow. I know it's unprofessional to ask, but could you possibly, Mrs. Sterling? He tried to inject authority into his voice, tried to sound like a man who made smart decisions instead of one whose body was already responding to the promise in her tone. Victoria, she corrected softly, and I'm alone, Achilles. Completely alone until Thursday morning. The silence stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss. On one side lay safety, professionalism, the life he'd carefully constructed. On the other waited the kind of risk that either destroyed everything or transformed it beyond recognition. Text me your address, he heard himself saying, his voice rough with inevitability. Thank you, she whispered, and the gratitude in her voice suggested they both knew he wasn't coming to fix her. Wi-Fi. The Meridian Towers concierge looked at Achilles like he was a puzzle that didn't quite fit a black man in work clothes. Carrying tech equipment into the building's most exclusive penthouse at nearly 1 a.m., the scrutiny felt familiar, the kind of casual suspicion that had followed him through Harvard's computer science program and into every boardroom he'd entered since. Mrs. Sterling is expecting me, Achilles said, meeting the man's gaze with practiced calm. Emergency network repair. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending into a different world, one where his Honda Civic would look absurd next to the Maseratis and Bentleys in the underground garage, where his annual income might cover a month's maintenance fees. Victoria answered the door in champagne silk that clung to her curves like liquid moonlight. Her hair loose around her shoulders and her feet bare against Italian marble. The robe was modest by most standards, but the way it moved with her body made Achilles forget how to breathe properly. You came, she said, and the relief in her voice suggested she genuinely wondered if he would. Her penthouse spread before him like a magazine spread floor, 2 ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. Art that probably cost more than his car. Furniture that whispered quiet luxury in every clean line. The kind of space that reminded him exactly how different their worlds were. The routers in the kitchen, Victoria said, leading him through rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. I think something's wrong with the connection. The kitchen gleamed with professional-grade appliances and countertops that reflected the city lights like mirrors. Victoria had already opened another bottle of wine, Two glasses waiting on the marble island like an invitation to abandon professional pretense. "Let me check the network settings," Achilles said, settling his laptop on the counter while Victoria poured wine with hands that trembled slightly. She stood behind him as he worked, close enough that her perfume mixed with the scent of wine and expensive fabric. When she leaned over to see the screen, her hair brushed his neck like silk, and her robe gaped enough to reveal the absence of anything beneath. "Is it fixable?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Achilles turned to answer and found her mouth inches from his, her eyes dark with want and wine. This time, no security guard interrupted them. No professional boundaries stood between desire and consequence. "Victoria," he said, her name, a question, and a prayer. "Fix me," she whispered against his lips, and Achilles realized some systems were meant to be completely rebuilt from the ground up when her hands found the buttons of his shirt. He stopped pretending this was about Wi-Fi. The Ritz-Carlton's bar hummed with a kind of expensive conversation that sealed million-dollar deals. Over $30 cocktails. Achilles nursed a beer he couldn't really afford, waiting for his client meeting to begin, when Victoria appeared like a vision in midnight blue silk that made every head in the room turn with magnetic precision. Their eyes met across the room with the force of a confession. She was supposed to be in Singapore with Marcus. He was supposed to be maintaining professional distance. Neither was supposed to be remembering how her kitchen counter had felt beneath her back 3 nights ago, when Wi-Fi repair had become something infinitely more intimate. "Mr. Smith," Victoria said as she approached his table, her voice carrying just enough surprise to fool the investment bankers who'd been trying to capture her attention. "What a coincidence." "Mrs. Sterling," he replied, standing with the kind, a formal courtesy that masked the way his pulse hammered against his throat. "I thought you were traveling." Change of plans. Her smile held secrets that made his skin feel electric. "Actually, I'm having some urgent issues with my laptop upstairs. You wouldn't happen to have time for a quick consultation, would you?" The elevator ride to the 23rd floor felt like ascending into pure temptation. Victoria stood close enough that he could smell her perfume, could feel the heat radiating from her body through expensive fabric, when their hands brushed. Reaching for the same button, the contact sent electricity shooting straight to his core. "Room 2347, she murmured as the doors opened, her keycard trembling slightly in fingers that had commanded boardrooms with surgical precision. The suite overlooked the harbor, city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds, but Achilles barely noticed the view. Victoria's laptop sat closed on the mahogany desk, a prop in a performance they both knew was about something far more dangerous than file recovery. "The presentation files," Victoria said, but her voice carried the breathless quality of someone whose priorities had shifted completely. "They're encrypted, and I can't seem to access her words," died as Achilles moved closer, his hands finding her waist with the kind of certainty that came from 3 nights of dreaming about exactly this moment. The laptop remained unopened, as Victoria's fingers tangled in his hair, as her mouth found his with desperate hunger. When he lifted her onto the desk, scattering hotel stationery and business cards, Victoria discovered that some systems were designed to be overwhelmed completely. Their coupling was fierce and tender, desperate and reverent. Everything that 3 nights of denied desire had promised. Later, as they lay tangled in Egyptian cotton sheets, Victoria traced patterns on his chest like she was memorizing him. "This changes everything," she whispered against his skin. Achilles pulled her closer, knowing she was right and no longer caring about the consequences. Victoria stood in the doorway of Achilles' Somerville apartment, taking in the careful contradiction of his world. The building might have been modest, but his home office was a temple to technological precision, multiple monitors arranged like mission control, servers humming quietly in custom-built racks, codes scrolling across screens and languages that spoke of serious expertise. "This isn't what I expected," she admitted, running her fingers along equipment that probably cost more than most people's cars. Her assumptions about his circumstances felt suddenly naive, classist in ways that made her cheeks burn with shame. "What did you expect?" Achilles asked, settling into his ergonomic chair with a kind of proprietary comfort that spoke of long hours building something meaningful from nothing. Before Victoria could answer, his laptop chimed with an incoming video call. His mother's face filled the screen, Lugant Sharpheed, wearing scrubs that suggested a medical profession and the kind of parental intuition that could diagnose problems from 3 time zones away. "Baby, you look tired," Dolores Smith said. Then noticed Victoria hovering in the background. "And you have company." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees as maternal protection kicked into overdrive. Victoria felt herself being assessed with the precision of someone who'd spent 30 years watching her son navigate a world designed to destroy black men who dared to excel. "Mom, this is Victoria Sterling," Achilles said carefully. "A client." "Client." Dolores repeated, the word carrying enough skepticism to power a small city. "At 10 p.m. on a Sunday night. In your apartment." Victoria stepped forward, extending her hand toward the camera with the kind of confidence that usually commanded boardrooms. "Mrs. Smith, it's a pleasure to meet you. Your son has been absolutely brilliant with our network infrastructure." The silence that followed felt like a judgment being rendered. Dolores Smith had raised a son who'd earned his Harvard degree with scholarships and determination, who'd built a business through merit rather than connections. She'd seen too many promising young men derailed by white women who collected diversity like accessories. "I'm sure he has," Dolores said, finally. "Achilles, we'll talk tomorrow." The screen went dark, leaving them alone with the weight of unspoken warnings. Victoria moved to Achilles' chair, settling onto his lap with the kind of vulnerable intimacy that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with comfort. "She hates me," Victoria said against his neck. "She's protecting me," Achilles corrected, his arms circling her waist. "From women who might not understand what it costs for someone like me to trust someone like you." Victoria pulled back to meet his eyes, seeing the careful walls he'd built around his heart. "Then show me," she whispered. "Help me understand." When he kissed her this time, it felt like the beginning of something deeper than passion, like the foundation of trust being laid one truth at a time. The Sterling Dynamics boardroom gleamed with corporate authority as Victoria presented quarterly projections to 12 investment partners, her voice carrying the confident precision that had built her reputation. Achilles worked beneath the conference table, installing new networking cables with practiced invisibility, their secret burning between them like Livewire. Marcus Sterling wasn't supposed to return from Singapore until Friday. His voice in the hallway hit Victoria like a physical blow, causing her to stumble mid-sentence about market penetration, while the man who'd been penetrating her for the past week crouched inches from her legs. "Darling," Marcus announced, sweeping into the boardroom with a kind of commanding presence that made lesser executives straighten their spines. Tall, silver-haired, wielding privilege like a weapon he'd been born knowing how to use. "I caught an earlier flight to surprise you." Victoria's phone buzzed against her thigh, a text from Achilles that she couldn't possibly check with her husband's calculating gaze fixed on her face. Marcus kissed her cheek with proprietary affection, his hand finding her shoulder with a kind of possessive touch that made her skin crawl. "Technical difficulties?" Marcus asked, noticing Achilles emerging from beneath the table with professional composure that masked the way his jaw had tightened at witnessing the kiss. "Network upgrade," Victoria managed, her voice steadier than her pulse. Mr. Smith was just finishing the installation. The introduction felt like stepping onto a minefield. Marcus extended his hand with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. Measuring Achilles with the casual assessment of someone who categorized people by their usefulness to his agenda. "Marcus Sterling," he said, his grip lasting exactly long enough to establish dominance. "I trust everything's working properly now." "Should be running smoothly," Achilles replied, packing his tools with deliberate efficiency while Victoria fought the urge to touch him, to somehow bridge the chasm that Marcus's presence had torn between them. During the coffee break, Victoria escaped to the server room under the pretense of checking the network stability. Achilles was waiting, his hands finding her waist with desperate hunger as she pressed him against the server rack. "This is insane," he whispered against her mouth, but his body betrayed him, responding to her touch with the kind of need that 3 days of stolen moments had only intensified. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Marcus. "Dinner tonight, 8 p.m., wear the red dress." The command made her stomach clench with dread and rebellion in equal measure. When she looked up at Achilles, she saw her own recognition reflected in his dark eyes. The game had just changed, and the stakes had become potentially lethal. "He knows," she whispered. The mahogany-paneled conference room at Sterling. Whitmore and Associates felt like a tribunal designed to crush souls beneath imported leather and Ivy League diplomas. Achilles sat across from Marcus Sterling, flanked by a private investigator whose camera equipment lay spread across the table like instruments of surgical destruction. "Mr. Smith," Marcus began, his voice carrying the polished cruelty of someone who'd spent decades weaponizing privilege. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Achilles kept his expression neutral, though his hands clenched beneath the table. He'd walked into this meeting expecting negotiation, perhaps even reasonable discussion. Instead, he'd found an execution. "I see a predator," Marcus continued, sliding a tablet across the mahogany surface. "Someone who exploits vulnerable women under the guise of professional service." The screen displayed surveillance footage that made Achilles' blood turn to ice him entering Victoria's penthouse, emerging hours later with the disheveled look of a man who'd done far more than fix Wi-Fi. Hotel security cameras capturing their elevator encounter. Time-stamped evidence of every stolen moment they'd thought was private. "Interesting business model," the private investigator said, his voice carrying Boston Brahmin contempt. "Though, I suppose when you're from Roxbury, you take opportunities where you find them." The racial coding was subtle, but unmistakable, the implication that Achilles was nothing more than a predatory black man taking advantage of a wealthy white woman's vulnerability. The narrative would destroy him professionally and personally. Reduce 3 Harvard degrees and 15 years of expertise to a stereotype that had been used to lynch men who looked like him. "What do you want?" Achilles asked, though he already knew the answer. "Complete cessation of contact with my wife," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair with predatory satisfaction. "Immediate termination of all business relationships with Sterling Dynamics and our affiliated companies. And your silence about whatever delusional fantasy Victoria has convinced herself she's living." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus controlled contracts worth millions across Boston's corporate landscape. One word from him could blacklist Achilles from every major client, reduce his carefully built business to rubble. "Refuse," Marcus continued, "and these images become evidence in a sexual harassment lawsuit that will follow you for the rest of your career. Try to contact Victoria again, and I'll make sure every tech company in New England knows exactly what kind of tech man they'd be hiring." Achilles stared at the photographs, seeing his destruction mapped out in digital clarity. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, a fury that had been building since childhood. Since every time he'd been told to know his place. "And if I agree to your terms?" he asked quietly. Marcus smiled like a shark scenting blood. Then this conversation never happened. Victoria's office felt different with FBI Special Agent Sarah Chen and her cybercrimes. team occupying the leather chairs that had witnessed so many corporate power plays. Achilles sat beside Victoria, his laptop displaying code that would have made Marcus's blood run cold if he'd understood what he was looking at. "Mrs. Sterling," Agent Chen said, reviewing the encrypted files spread across her tablet. "You're alleging that your husband has been using Sterling Dynamics network infrastructure to facilitate cryptocurrency fraud on a massive scale." "Not alleging," Victoria corrected, her voice carrying the steel that had built her reputation. "Proving." She nodded to Achilles, who began pulling up financial records that painted a picture of systematic embezzlement disguised as legitimate blockchain investments. "The beauty of Marcus's scheme," Achilles explained, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with surgical precision, "was that he embedded the fraud within real cryptocurrency transactions. Client investment funds were diverted through Shell. Companies then laundered through NFT purchases and digital art sales." Agent Chen leaned forward, studying the data streams that revealed millions in stolen funds. "How long has this been going on?" 3 years, Victoria said, the number carrying the weight of her own complicity. "I suspected something when our client portfolios started showing discrepancies, but Marcus always had explanations. It wasn't until Achilles helped me access the blockchain ledgers that we could prove the systematic theft." The irony wasn't lost. On any of them, the same technical expertise that had brought Victoria and Achilles together had also exposed her husband's crimes. What had started as emergency server repair had evolved into forensic accounting that revealed corruption worth $47 million. "The surveillance footage Marcus threatened you with," Agent Chen said to Achilles, "he obtained it through illegal network intrusions, which ironically gave us the probable cause we needed to seize his systems." Achilles smiled grimly. "He got so focused on destroying my reputation that he forgot I might know how to trace his digital footprints. Every hack he commissioned, every illegal surveillance operation, it's all documented in his encrypted communications." Victoria watched her husband's empire crumble in real time as federal agents prepared arrest warrants. The man who'd tried to weaponize race and class against Achilles had been undone by the very technology he dismissed as beneath his notice. "There's something else," Victoria said quietly, pulling up one final file. Marcus wasn't working alone. The law firm's senior partners were actively facilitating the money laundering through their trust accounts. Agent Chen's eyebrows rose as she reviewed the evidence. "Mrs. Sterling, you've just handed us the biggest white-collar crime case of the year." Outside the office windows, FBI vehicles were already surrounding Sterling, Whitmore, and Associates. Justice, Victoria realized, had its own kind of digital signature. The federal courthouse steps felt like a stage for justice as Marcus Sterling emerged in handcuffs. His silver hair disheveled and his expensive suit wrinkled from a night in federal custody. News cameras captured every moment of his perp walk. The man who'd wielded privilege like a weapon now reduced to another white-collar criminal facing 25 years for cyber fraud and money laundering. Victoria stood beside Achilles, watching her husband's empire crumble in real time. The same arrogance that had made Marcus underestimate a service provider from Roxbury had blinded him to the digital evidence he'd left scattered across encrypted servers, like breadcrumbs leading to his own destruction. $47 million. Agent Chen said as they watched the motorcade disappear toward federal detention. The largest cryptocurrency embezzlement case in Massachusetts history. "You two just saved hundreds of investors from financial ruin." Back in Victoria's office, the weight of transformation settled around them like expensive perfume. The space that had once symbolized corporate hierarchy now felt like the headquarters of their rebellion against every system designed to keep them apart. "It's over," Victoria said, the words carrying 3 months of tension finally released. Marcus's threats had evaporated with his arrest. The surveillance footage meaningless now that his crimes overshadowed any Personal indiscretions. Achilles moved toward her with the kind of predatory grace that had first caught her attention, his hands finding her waist as she leaned back against the mahogany desk where everything had begun. "Not over," he corrected, his voice rough with desire and relief. "Just beginning." When he kissed her, it tasted like freedom and vindication, like every stolen moment had been justified by this victory. Victoria's fingers found his shirt buttons with desperate efficiency, months of careful boundaries dissolving as they claimed each other with the intensity of people who'd survived a war. The executive desk that had witnessed so many power plays became their altar as Achilles lifted her onto its polished surface, scattering quarterly reports and merger documents that no longer mattered. Their coupling was fierce and celebratory, every touch carrying the weight of justice, served, and futures reclaimed. Later, as Victoria traced patterns on his chest like she was memorizing him, Achilles caught her hand in his. "Your mother-in-law called while you were testifying," he said quietly. "She wants to meet properly. Apparently, taking down a $47 million embezzlement scheme has impressed her." Victoria laughed, the sound carrying genuine joy. "For the first time in months, think she'll approve of me dating her son." "Dating?" Achilles asked, his smile carrying promises that made her pulse quicken. "Mrs. Sterling, I was thinking more along the lines of a hostile takeover." The city lights twinkled below them like scattered diamonds, illuminating the beginning of something that belonged entirely to them. Sterling-Smith. Cybersecurity occupied the entire 15th floor of a Cambridge innovation hub, its glass walls overlooking the Charles River like a declaration of transparent partnership. Victoria stood before the assembled crowd at their one-year anniversary celebration, her engagement ring catching the afternoon light as she watched Achilles demonstrate their latest blockchain security protocol to a room full of venture capitalists and tech leaders. "When we started this company," Victoria said, addressing investors who'd initially questioned whether a former CEO and a freelance technician could build something revolutionary, people asked if our partnership was sustainable. Today, our cyber fraud prevention software protects over $200 million in client assets. Dolores Smith sat in the front row, her earlier skepticism replaced by maternal pride, as she watched her son command a room full of Harvard MBAs and Silicon Valley legends. Beside her, Victoria's parents nodded approvingly their daughter's choice to rebuild her life with a man who'd proven his worth through competence rather than inheritance, had earned their grudging respect. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that Marcus's downfall had liberated not just $47 million in stolen funds, but also the venture capital they'd needed to launch their company. His former clients had flocked to Sterling Smith like refugees seeking protection from the very crimes that had victimized them. "The blockchain integration is seamless," Achilles explained, his presentation style carrying the confident authority of someone who'd learned to translate complex technical concepts into profit margins. "We're essentially creating digital immune systems that adapt to emerging threats in real time." As guests mingled around catered hors d'oeuvres, Victoria felt Achilles' hand find her waist, his thumb tracing small circles against the silk of her dress that made her pulse quicken with familiar desire. A year of partnership had only intensified their attraction boardroom presentations that ended with stolen kisses in server rooms, late-night coding sessions that dissolved into passionate encounters on their shared desk. 5 minutes, Achilles whispered against her ear as the crowd began to thin, his voice carrying promises that made her skin feel electric. "My office." Victoria excused herself from conversations with venture capitalists, her pulse hammering as she slipped into Achilles' corner office. He followed moments later, locking the door behind him with deliberate intent. "We have a room full of investors," she protested weakly as his hands found the zipper of her dress. But her body was already responding to his touch with a kind of hunger that a year of legitimate partnership had only amplified. "They can wait," Achilles murmured. lifting her onto his desk where their empire had been planned and their future coded into existence. Besides, I want to celebrate our success properly. When he claimed her mouth with desperate reverence, Victoria tasted triumph and desire in equal measure, their coupling fierce and celebratory against the backdrop of everything they'd built together. Later, as they straightened their clothes and prepared to rejoin their celebration, Victoria realized some partnerships were worth every risk taken to achieve them.